A entitled millionaire mocks a fast food worker. The truth about her leaves his family stunned. Charles Whitaker strode into the fast food restaurant, his expensive suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to the cheerful, brightly colored decor. He glanced around with disdain, his lips curling into a sneer as he approached the counter. Lily, a young cashier with a gentle smile and kind eyes, greeted him warmly. "Welcome, sir. How may I help you today?" Charles scoffed, his gaze sweeping over her uniform. "I doubt you can help me with anything that matters, but I suppose you can take my order. I'll have the number 3 combo, and make it quick. I don't have all day." Lily nodded, her smile never wavering despite his rudeness. As she rang up his order, Charles tapped his foot impatiently, his eyes wandering to the other patrons. He couldn't fathom why anyone would choose to eat in such a place, surrounded by the stench of grease and the chatter of the unwashed masses. When Lily handed him his receipt, Charles snatched it from her hand. "I hope you realize how insignificant your job is," he sneered. "You're nothing more than a cog in a machine, a faceless drone serving slop to the masses." Lily's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly composed herself. "Every job has its purpose, sir. I take pride in what I do, no matter how small it may seem." Charles laughed derisively. "Pride? In this? You're delusional, girl. You'll never amount to anything, and you'll always be stuck serving people like me." With that, he turned on his heel and stalked away, leaving Lily to ponder his words as she watched him go. Miles away, in a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city, a man named Robert Blackwell sat in his study, his eyes fixed on a faded photograph. The image showed a young woman with the same gentle smile and kind eyes as Lily, cradling a tiny baby in her arms. Robert sighed, his fingers tracing the edges of the photograph. It had been nearly 20 years since he'd last seen his daughter, 20 years since his wife had disappeared into the night, taking their child with her. He'd searched for them tirelessly, using every resource at his disposal, but they'd vanished without a trace. Now, as he stared at the photograph, Robert couldn't help but wonder what had become of his little girl. Was she happy? Was she safe? Did she know how much he loved her? How much he longed to hold her in his arms once more? A knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, hastily tucking the photograph into his desk drawer. His assistant, a middle-aged woman named Margaret, entered the room, a stack of papers in her hand. "Sir, I have the latest reports from our investigators. They believe they may have found a lead on your daughter's whereabouts." Robert's heart leaped in his chest. "Where?" he demanded, rising from his chair. Margaret hesitated, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "It's a long shot, sir, but they think she may be working at a fast food restaurant in the city. A girl matching her description was seen there recently." Robert's mind raced, hope and fear battling within him. Could it really be her, after all these years? He had to know, had to see for himself. "Prepare the car," he ordered, his voice trembling with emotion. "I'm going to find my daughter." Charles Whitaker leaned back in his leather office chair, a self-satisfied smirk on his face as he surveyed the city skyline from his penthouse office. He'd built his fortune on the backs of others, using his wealth and influence to crush anyone who stood in his way. As he sipped his scotch, his mind wandered back to the encounter at the fast food restaurant. The girl's words echoed in his head, her quiet strength and grace in the face of his cruelty gnawing at him. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. She was nothing, just another insignificant cog in the machine of life. He, on the other hand, was a king, a man who could buy and sell people like her 1,000 times over. A knock at the door interrupted his musings. "Enter," he barked, setting his glass down on the desk. His secretary, a mousy woman named Alice, scurried into the room, her eyes wide with fear. "Sir, there's been a development. Robert Blackwell has discovered the location of his long-lost daughter." Charles frowned, the name vaguely familiar. Blackwell, the old man who's been searching for his kid for years. What's that got to do with me? Alice swallowed hard, her hands trembling. "Sir, his daughter. She's the girl from the fast food restaurant. The one you..." Charles's eyes widened, his heart pounding in his chest. The girl, The insignificant cashier he'd mocked and belittled was the daughter of one of the most influential men in the city. A man with deep ties to his own family, ties that could destroy everything he'd built. He leaped to his feet, his mind racing. He had to do something, had to find a way to control the situation before it spiraled out of control. But even as he plotted and schemed, he couldn't shake the feeling that his world was about to come crashing down around him. Lily wiped down the counter, humming softly to herself as she worked. The encounter with the rude businessman had shaken her, but she refused to let his words define her. She knew her worth, knew that her job was more than just serving food. As she turned to greet the next customer, she froze, her eyes widening in shock. Standing before her was a man she'd only seen in faded photographs and half-remembered dreams. A man with her eyes, her smile, her very soul. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Robert Blackwell nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Lily, my little girl, I've been searching for you for so long." Lily stumbled out from behind the counter, throwing herself into his arms. They clung to each other, crying and laughing and marveling at the miracle of their reunion. Around them, the restaurant fell silent, the patrons and staff watching in awe as father and daughter embraced for the first time in 20 years. In that moment, Lily knew that her life would never be the same. She had a family, a history, a legacy that extended far beyond the walls of the fast food restaurant. And with her father by her side, she knew that she could face anything, even the cruelty and disdain of men like Charles Whitaker. News of Lily's true identity spread like wildfire, the story of the long-lost daughter of Robert Blackwell captivating the city. Overnight, she became a symbol of hope and resilience, a shining example of the strength that lies within even the most unlikely of heroes. At first, Charles tried to dismiss the news, tried to convince himself that it didn't matter. But as the days passed, he found himself haunted by the memory of his cruelty, by the knowledge that he had belittled and demeaned the daughter of a man who could destroy him with a single word. He watched in growing horror as his world began to unravel, as his family and friends turned their backs on him, as his business partners began to distance themselves from his toxic brand. Desperate, he reached out to Robert Blackwell, hoping to strike a deal, to buy his silence and his daughter's forgiveness. But Robert refused, his eyes hard and unyielding as he stared down the man who had dared to insult his child. "You have no power here, Mr. Whitaker," he said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "Your money, your influence, your very name, they mean nothing to me. All that matters is my daughter, and the love and respect she deserves." Charles reeled back, his face pale and drawn. He had always believed that wealth was the ultimate power, that money could buy anything and anyone. But now, faced with the unshakable resolve of a father's love, he began to realize just how wrong he had been. As Lily stepped into her father's mansion, she felt a sense of awe and wonder wash over her. The grand foyer, with its sweeping staircase and glittering chandelier, was like something out of a fairy tale, a far cry from the humble apartment she'd called home for so long. But even as she marveled at the opulence surrounding her, Lily couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. This was a world she'd never known, a world of wealth and privilege that seemed so far removed from the life she'd built for herself. As if sensing her discomfort, Robert placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I know this is all new to you, Lily," he said softly, "but I want you to know that this is your home now too. You belong here, with me, with your family." Lily nodded, her eyes filling with tears. She had spent so long wondering about her past, about the family she'd never known. And now, here she was, standing in the very heart of that family, surrounded by love and acceptance. But even as she reveled in the joy of her newfound family, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She thought of her friends at the fast food restaurant, of the community she'd built there, and her heart ached with longing. She knew that she couldn't turn her back on her past, on the people who had been there for her when she had nothing. And so, with a determined smile, she turned to her father and said, "Dad, I want to go back to the restaurant. I want to show them that I'm still the same Lily, no matter what my last name is." Robert hesitated for a moment, but seeing the resolve in his daughter's eyes, he nodded. "Of course, Lily. Whatever you need." And so, hand in hand, father and daughter set out to face the world, ready to build a new life together while never forgetting the ones they'd left behind. Charles paced his office, his mind racing as he tried to find a way out of the mess he'd created. He'd always been a man who could buy his way out of any problem, but now, faced with the unyielding force of Robert Blackwell's love for his daughter, he found himself at a loss. As he stared out the window, his eyes fell on the fast food restaurant across the street, the very place where he'd first encountered Lily. And suddenly, an idea began to form in his mind. If he could somehow make amends with Lily, if he could show her that he was more than just a cruel, entitled millionaire, perhaps he could salvage his reputation. Perhaps he could find a way to redeem himself in the eyes of the world. With a newfound sense of purpose, Charles strode out of his office, determined to make things right. He knew that it wouldn't be easy, that he would have to face the consequences of his actions and the judgment of those he'd wronged. But for the first time in his life, Charles realized that there were things more important than money and power. Things like compassion, like kindness, like the simple act of treating others with respect and dignity. And so, as he made his way to the restaurant, his heart pounding in his chest, Charles vowed to become a better man, to use his wealth and influence not to crush others, but to lift them up, to make the world a little bit brighter, one small act of kindness at a time. Lily stood behind the counter, her heart swelling with pride as she looked out over the familiar faces of her co-workers and customers. She had spent so long wondering about her past, about the family she'd never known. But now, standing here in the place that had been her home for so long, she realized that family was more than just blood. As she served up orders and chatted with regulars, Lily couldn't help but marvel at the outpouring of love and support she'd received since the news of her true identity had broken. People from all over the city had come to the restaurant, not just to eat, but to catch a glimpse of the long-lost daughter of Robert Blackwell, to show their support and admiration for the quiet strength and grace she'd shown in the face of adversity. But even as she basked in the warmth of her community, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. She'd seen the look in Charles Whitaker's eyes when he'd learned the truth about her identity, seen the fear and desperation that had flashed across his face. She knew that a man like Charles wasn't used to being challenged, wasn't used to having his power and influence questioned. And she couldn't help but wonder what he would do, how far he would go to protect his own interests. But as she looked around at the faces of those she loved, at the community that had embraced her and lifted her up, Lily knew that she was not alone. She had the strength of her father, the love of her friends, and the unshakable conviction that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would face them with courage and grace, always standing up for what was right. As Charles stepped into the fast food restaurant, he felt a sense of unease wash over him. He'd always seen places like this as beneath him, as the domain of the poor and the powerless. But now, faced with the reality of his own actions, he began to see things in a different light. He watched as Lily moved behind the counter, her smile warm and genuine as she greeted each customer with kindness and respect. And suddenly, he felt a pang of shame, a realization of just how wrong he'd been to treat her, to treat anyone, with such cruelty and disdain. Taking a deep breath, Charles approached the counter, his heart pounding in his chest. "Lily," he said softly, his voice trembling with emotion, "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. Sorry for the way I treated you. Sorry for the pain I caused." Lily looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. She'd never expected to hear those words from a man like Charles Whitaker, never expected him to show an ounce of remorse or regret. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something there that she'd never seen before, a glimmer of humanity, a spark of the man he could be, if only he had the courage to let go of his pride and his prejudice. "I forgive you, Mr. Whitaker," she said softly, her voice filled with compassion. "But forgiveness isn't enough. If you truly want to make things right, you have to be willing to change, to become a better man." Charles nodded, his eyes filling with tears. He knew that she was right. knew that he had a long road ahead of him. But for the first time in his life, he felt a sense of hope, a belief that he could be more than just a wealthy, entitled man. And so, with a final nod of thanks, Charles turned and walked out of the restaurant, ready to face the world, ready to become the man he'd always had the potential to be. As news of Charles's apology spread throughout the city, Lily found herself at the center of a media frenzy. Reporters camped outside the restaurant, eager to catch a glimpse of the woman who had inspired such a profound change in one of the city's most notorious figures. But Lily, ever humble and gracious, refused to let the attention go to her head. She continued to work at the restaurant, continued to serve her community with the same quiet strength and kindness that had always been her hallmark. And as she watched Charles begin to change, begin to use his wealth and influence to make a real difference in the world, Lily couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had always believed in the power of compassion, in the idea that even the smallest acts of kindness could change lives. Now, seeing that belief play out on a grand scale, seeing the ripple effect of her own actions, Lily knew that she had been right all along. That true strength came not from money or power, but from the simple, everyday choices that each and every one of us makes. As she looked out over her community, at the faces of those she loved and the city she called home, Lily knew that she had found her true calling, not as the daughter of a wealthy man, not as a symbol of hope and resilience, but as a person who used her own struggles and triumphs to make the world a little bit brighter, one small act of kindness at a time. As the weeks turned into months, Charles found himself on a journey of self-discovery, a quest to become the man he'd always had the potential to be. He began to volunteer at local charities, to use his wealth and influence to support causes that truly mattered. At first, many were skeptical of his change of heart, believing that it was just another publicity stunt, another way for him to boost his own ego and reputation. But as time went on, as Charles's actions began to speak louder than his words, people started to see him in a different light. They saw a man who was willing to admit his mistakes, to face the consequences of his actions with humility and grace. They saw a man who was using his privilege not to oppress others, but to lift them up, to create a world where everyone had the chance to thrive. And at the center of it all was Lily, the woman who had inspired him to change, the woman who had shown him the true meaning of strength and resilience. As Charles worked alongside her, as he watched her continue to serve her community with the same quiet grace and kindness that had always been her hallmark, he couldn't help but be humbled by her example. He knew that he still had a long way to go, that he would always carry the weight of his past mistakes. But with Lily by his side, with the love and support of those around him, Charles knew that he could face anything, that he could become the man he'd always had the potential to be. As the story of Charles's redemption spread throughout the city, Lily found herself at the center of a new kind of attention. People began to see her not just as a symbol of hope and resilience, but as a catalyst for change, a person who had the power to inspire others to be their best selves. She was invited to speak at schools and community events, to share her story and her message of compassion and kindness. And as she stood before crowds of eager faces, Lily couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose, a belief that she was exactly where she was meant to be. But even as she reveled in the joy of her new role, Lily never forgot her roots, never forgot the community that had always been there for her. She continued to work at the restaurant, continued to serve her customers with the same warmth and care that had always been her trademark. And as she watched her co-workers and friends begin to thrive, as she saw the ripple effect of her own actions spreading throughout the city, Lily knew that she had found her true calling, not as a wealthy heiress, not as a public figure, but as a person who used her own struggles and triumphs to make the world a little bit brighter, one small act of kindness at a time. As the months turned into years, Lily and Charles found themselves growing closer, their bond forged by the shared experience of personal growth and transformation. They became partners not just in their work, but in their lives, supporting each other through the ups and downs of their journey. And as they looked out over the city they called home, at the community they had helped to build and nurture, they couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. They had started out as two very different people, separated by wealth and privilege and the cruel realities of the world. But through the power of compassion, through the simple act of treating others with kindness and respect, they had found a way to bridge that gap, to create a world where everyone had the chance to thrive, regardless of their background or circumstances. And as they stood hand in hand, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring, Lily and Charles knew that they had found something truly precious. Not just love, not just partnership, but a shared commitment to making the world a better place, one small act of kindness at a time. Years later, as Lily stood before a crowd of eager faces, sharing her story and her message of hope and resilience, she couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought of her father, of the love and support he had always shown her, even in the darkest of times. She thought of her co-workers and friends, of the community that had embraced her and lifted her up, even when she had nothing. And she thought of Charles, of the man he had become, of the partner and friend he had proven himself to be. As she looked out over the sea of faces, Lily knew that her story was not just her own, but a testament to the power of the human spirit, to the idea that each and every one of us has the potential to change the world, if only we have the courage to try. And so, with a final smile and a nod of thanks, Lily stepped down from the stage, ready to continue her journey, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. She knew that she was not alone, that she had the love and support of those around her, and the unshakable conviction that, no matter what, she would always stand up for what was right. As she walked out into the world, Lily knew that her story was just beginning, that there were still so many lives to touch, so many hearts to inspire. But she was ready to face the future with courage and grace, always standing tall in the face of adversity, always shining a light of hope and compassion in a world that so desperately needed it.